All right. Well, thank you everybody for meeting today. This is the joint panel on American politics and identity politics for the 2021 New York State Political Science Association annual conference. I'm Dr. Joshua Medall. I'm the chair of the American Politics session, and I will let Howell introduce himself for the identity politics.
Hi everyone, I'm Howell Williams. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Western Connecticut State University, and I am the section chair of identity politics for the New York State Political Science Association. And Josh and I are co-chairing and co-discussing today's panel.
Excellent. And Adam has agreed to act as a discussant, so he's going to be giving all comments on everyone's kind of papers, but we're going to have ample opportunity for everyone to talk to each other because no one really shared around papers being a virtual conference. We're going to discuss based on the presentations and live and have really organic feedback, which I think is great, honestly. So with that being said, when we'll wait for our other participant, we'll let them in if they show up. But if you don't mind, Brian, I'm going to have you start first with your presentation, and then we'll go to Tanisha and then Adam, if that sounds good.
Okay, that's fine.
All right.
Great.
All right. So, Brian, I'll let you take it away.
I'm getting it loaded up, so it's taking a little longer than expected, but
that happens.
Yeah.
And for everyone who doesn't know how to use Teams, the little arrow with the white box is the share button if you have a presentation. So it's next to the leave button, which is dangerous.
Okay, I got it up. Now let me try to get it into Teams. Okay, I think I got it.
Excellent. We can see it.
All right. So basically, we did a statistical model concerning the prediction of 2020 American presidential election. So it's a very engineering statistical kind of approach, and we figured we can try to determine the effects of the output of the election using these approach. And it's just based on, we use probability and statistics, and basically the input data that we used was from the different polling data from very well-known sources that we have. And so the assumption is going to be based on the premise that the polls capture the pulse of the people as how they are planning to vote in the actual presidential election. If the polling is correct, the mathematical model should be correct as well, you know, the statistical model. So to that extent, we use some dynamic model, you know, as the result of the poll depends on the timing as well as the political events that are occurring in the country at the time. So it's kind of strange, it can at times. So basically, as we all know, that the United States has basically a two-party system, and the two candidates will be from basically either Democratic or Republican Party for the most part. So this model that we use will concentrate on the actual general presidential election and ignore all the primaries and everything else that occurred. So that kind of makes things a bit more complicated if we included the primaries. So using probability and statistics, so basically we had to get the data. So all the data of the different polls are going to be based on the 50 states. So we had polling, so we have managed to get polling data in most states. So in some states, there wasn't really much in the way of polling. So like, for example, like Utah, for example. And so we kind of assumed that it would go to a Republican instead. We're going by the past, you know, what it looks like in the past outcome. So the polling data will be collected and arranged, and then we develop like a histogram, look at the behavior, and then we estimated some probability density function of the polling data. And we could use such things like the normal distribution, log normal distribution, or even the beta distribution. So we kind of looked at it using different types of distribution. And then once we could figure that out, we used well-known techniques such as the chi-square test, and we also used the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test to test it. So the chi-square test is probably more widely known and more used, so we kind of basically looked at that. So after the threshold value, we used in a mathematical calculation, and then once we get the probability of getting that threshold, we use that information of the chosen probability distribution. And as we kind of know that the normal distribution is just going to be the mean and the standard deviation. Those are the two main parameters of the normal distribution that we kind of focus on. So on the other hand, if we can look at the normal uniform distribution for behaviors as well as the log normal, but mainly we kind of just use log normal and then the normal distribution. So once we have all the data and we did the appropriate statistical tests and modeling, then we were able to declare the winner. And then we assigned the electoral college vote for the two candidates. So whoever wins got the votes, but we know there's some caveats to that, which will kind of come through. So the information about the popular vote is also going to be collected as well. And then once we know that, we did it for all 50 states. Once we did that, we can determine who the winner was. So the model was first proposed in 2008 in the 2012 presidential election. And the model was quite accurate in the 2008 and 2012 election. And my argument there, as I told Professor Pushka, is that things were pretty obvious at that time. So we really didn't dwell on what the outcomes would really be and worrying about high level precision because it was already there. So basically, she presented it in the WPSA, I think that's called the Western Political Science Association meetings in Vancouver. And so the work dealt with the 2012 elections was first presented at the New York Political Science Association in Syracuse. And then so we had the actual tables, and we're going to show some of the results that we came up with. Oh, by the way, I am not a political scientist. I'm an economist. And so looking at presidential elections and presidential forecasting is more my avocation, not my vocation. I think it's kind of interesting to kind of look at these kinds of things. So we looked at polling data here. We just basically identified what sources that we use. So we had it for Alabama, Alaska, and then we basically did it that way, and we used the polling data, the date of when it was administered, and so on. As you can kind of see in some states, they don't really have much, like Arkansas, for example, but California, there was a lot. And then here's another one. We basically updated it using the appropriate data whenever the source came out, and then we incorporated it into the analysis. So we could, and it was a very dynamic process. So in other words, if a new poll came out, we replaced the old one. So it wasn't static. So we kind of just replaced it as it was coming through. But you could see in some of them, some of the polls didn't really change that much. They only came out once or twice, and that was it. And that's what we had to go by. And then we did the continue on with this. It's just more, this is different states. And then there's more based on the different polling that we've had and more. And then finally complete that. And then there's just more of it. And you see most of the polling was occurring in late September and October. We didn't really see anything prior to the election, right before. So now we can get into some of the hardcore numbers. So the statistical analysis of the statewide polling data for the popular vote. So we calculated the mean and the standard deviation for both the candidate Biden at the time, and then candidate Trump. And then we calculated the mean and the standard deviation based on the polling data for each one of them. And then we did it for all the states. So this is just more, and then more. And then we can kind of see that in some states, there might be very small numbers, like Wyoming, for example. So it'd be like 0 for the standard deviation, and then the mean would be kind of high. So like, for example, Wyoming, all of it went to, so the mean was basically for all of Trump. So basically in the Wyoming data, there was probably not a whole lot of disparity that actually occurred. So then once we did that, then we calculated the probability of winning. And then once we determined the probability, then who the winner was, then we allocated the electoral college votes to either Biden or Trump, whoever won. So it's kind of almost like a winner take all thing. So like Alabama, for example, we had Trump winning 100% in probability. So he earned all 9 electoral college votes. And then in a state like Arizona, Trump was 90.32%, and then what wound up happening, actually it was Biden. So Biden won, he got all 11 electoral college votes. And then we can see for another state like Florida, for example, it actually was 62.8% for Biden, and then Biden got all 29 electoral college votes. But as we kind of know, on election night, that did not happen, and candidate Trump got all 29 electoral college votes. So we did it for all the states this way, and then so it's tedious, but once you have the data set up, and you can just update the algorithms when necessary. And then we did it for all the states, and then Iowa, for example, we had Trump at 100%, and he got all 6 electoral college votes, and so on and so on. So we did it all this way, going all the way down. And then once we did that, then here's the rest of it. And so we can see that it was kind of, that's how we kind of did it. But the interesting part was, for example, that kind of struck me when we were doing the analysis was Texas. Well, Texas is only at 73.24%, even though that's a heavily Republican state. I'm not sure for how much if it's going to remain that way, but he only got 73.24%, and then but all of it went to Trump. All 38 electoral college votes went to Trump. Then we did the forecasting of it by popular vote, and then once we did the popular vote, and then we did it for the electoral college vote, and we did it all the way throughout. And then when we calculate the popular vote, each state had, Trump got 56% in Alabama, so he got all the electoral college vote. It's kind of like the electoral college votes. It's like winner takes all kind of approach. But again, there's caveats to that, because in the state of like Nebraska, there's one district that can kind of go either way based on whomever in that district voted for. And that one district in Nebraska went for Biden, for example. I think it was in the Omaha area. So that they went for Biden. So we did it for all that. And then at the end of it, we estimated the popular vote. So Biden had 49.2%, and Trump had 45.58%. And then based on the electoral college vote, we estimated it to be 350, and then Trump will be at 188. But it turned out that it was not the case, and Biden got 306, and Trump got 200 and almost 230 electoral college votes. So we basically kind of said, based on the mathematical model that we developed using the input data that we had, we said basically Biden will win the 2020 presidential election. And based on our analysis, the mathematical model predicts that Biden will win by a wide margin, both electorally and the popular vote. Now, before the election, me and Chandra had an intense debate about this, and I think I told him at the time, I said the election is probably much more closer than we realize, that we realize. And then here's just the more poll numbers that we had, just looking at histograms, just in case someone's interested in looking at that. And then the Trump individual poll numbers, and we did, calculated all that. And then just in case you want to see what the histograms look like. So what are the findings that we came up with? Despite our findings, the presidential race was still quite fluid. So even though the mathematical model said this, I kind of suspected there's something more going on that's not being picked up. But we need to make sure that the accuracy in the polling data is crucial. As we all know, some polls are better than other polls. So the percentage of undecided voters is around 5 to 6%. So it's very hard to capture the undecided voters. So the undecideds typically go to the underdog at a rate of 75% in an election. So Trump was probably considered an underdog in 2020. So what will happen this time, as in Florida in 2016? Well, in 2016, Trump won, but he won by a larger margin in 2020. So recent polls show tightening in battleground states such as Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, and others. So what are the factors that were causing this tightening? And I thought the most ironic one, right before the election, like 3 or 4 days, Iowa all of a sudden became really super tight. And then there, by the, what's the name? The Des Moines Register, it was a very popular one in Iowa. They came out with their final prediction, and they were exactly right, that Trump would win Iowa, and then Joni Ernst would win re-election for the state Senate, and all that happened with their polling numbers. So something happened with the polling numbers at the very last minute, and it seems like somehow the Des Moines Register was able to capture it very well, nicely. And then another phenomenon that occurred that I mentioned to Chandra, some Republican voters are refusing to participate in polling Republican voters because they acknowledge the article there that we there. So with the implication of that also distort the sample for the polling, though we don't know. And then that's everything I have.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Brian. We'll give you some more comments at the end, but I appreciate it. I always love seeing a little forecasting model during American politics. All right. On that note, Tanisha, are you ready to head on next? We'll move to identity politics and then go back to American politics.
Sure.
Excellent. Thank you.
I think it's.
I think you need to stop sharing your screen, Brian.
Oh, yeah, that's one of my other bad habits.
Sorry, you said it's too. Oh, wait.
There's a white box.
Right? You said it was the one with the arrow pointing.
Yep, box with an arrow. If it's on the app, it's the one next to the leave button. Next to the microphone.
I'm on the browser, so what's next? It says show participants, but I see that the box with the arrow, and then it just says desktop window screen share.
Yes.
Okay.
There you go. Something.
Okay, application window. Let me see. I can just do this one and then I'll pull this up. Can you all see this?
There you go. It's coming. Yep.
Okay. Is it on there?
There's some of you. You're sharing something with us.
Am I sharing the presentation?
No, you're sharing the web browser of Microsoft Teams. You might just have to click your presentation.
Now?
Nope. Sorry. it's still the background. Now it's me.
Okay, let me see. Because when I click that, that's the only thing that pops up as open. Oh, wait, here it is now. It's showing now. Can you see this now?
Now we're cooking.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for this presentation, this group. So I am Tanisha Means, and my co-author on this piece is one of my undergraduate students, Ariana Gravenis. We are both at Vassar College, and we prepared this for this particular conference, actually. So the title of our paper that is very much in progress in our presentation is Judging Their Colleagues and Themselves, Judges' Perceptions and Reflections on the Politics of Judicial Decision Making. And so if I could just start us off a bit and give you a sense of sort of where we, like what inspired this talk, I think it would be helpful. So at least for me, so I teach classes in American politics and a lot of classes dealing with like law and courts. And I have always been very much interested in judges and judging and seeing judges as political actors. In my own experience as just a person, I've interacted with a judge when I was pulled over as an undergraduate, and I went to court to sort of fight for justice in that particular instance. And the judge decided to dismiss the case entirely, and she apologized to me in open court, and then she called a recess and actually called me back. And now that I'm a faculty member and like a professor, I'm thinking like, okay, the ethics of all of this is unclear, but at least like this is my experience. And so I left court feeling happy that I won, and that the judge understood what happened to me the evening that I was pulled over and sort of why I had this ticket for having my headlights turned off. But I went to grad school really thinking about, what influences judges' decisions? What influences them? Is it their identities, right? I'm a person who's very much interested in identity politics. So how does race and gender and ideology of a particular judge, how does that play a role in how judges, one, interpret facts, understand the law, and then actually decide cases and make decisions throughout the entire adjudication process? And so I had those sorts of questions, but also just going to grad school and thinking about interbranch politics and thinking about judicial independence, for example, and thinking about the need to protect judges from other political and legal actors. I also just had questions about how are judges interacting with others in government, and how are they influenced or not influenced, or why are they influenced by other actors and institutions? And so in class, I had Ariana in class, and sort of this paper sort of grew out of conversations that we had there, which is where students and I sort of got together and meditated and thought a lot about the politics of the judiciary, and thinking about the courts as political institutions, given that they decide cases that are political, and topics and issues that are political themselves, but also thinking about the politics of the courts and of judges in terms of the fact that perhaps judges are being influenced by things other than the law, other than case fact. And so that is sort of the framing that I would give for this particular project. The other thing is that, we are really trying to understand how judges see these particular topics. And that's a bit different than I think how it's often discussed in the literature, which I will get to in a second. And so just to situate us, that's what I would say. But in terms of the research questions for our project and for this paper, they are how political, so the broad question, how political are the courts in the eyes of state court judges? And then the subset, the questions, the secondary questions are, to what extent are the courts political? And then what influences their judicial colleagues and their own behavior and decision making? So again, thinking about it as, are the courts political? And finally, I'm thinking about some of the ways that scholars have talked about the politics of the courts and of judges. How do they see these factors as influencing decision making? So in terms of how this is situated in the existing scholarship, it's that there are so many books, so many articles on these topics, right? These topics of what influences state Supreme Court decisions, what influences decisions of U.S. Supreme Court judges, what influences federal court judges, what influences trial court judges, like all of these questions. I think scholars are really interested in adjudication and factors that influence decision making, because when we think about the courts, like that is primarily how we see, like how we see judges, right, as justice administrators. And so here are a number of books that we have engaged with for this project, although there are many others. These are some of just the main ones. And when we walked away from consulting all of this literature, what we felt was that people were thinking that a number of things, well, not just thinking, but people were saying and empirically showing that a number of factors influence decision making, right? So thinking about interest groups, thinking about other political actors, politicians in particular, elected officials. People were thinking about identity even, right? So race and gender and judges' ideology. People were also thinking about reelectability. And so, the significance of holding a particular judicial seat and wanting to continue on in that seat as influencing the decisions that judges make. And so when we see our work as being interlocutors in this way, we see it as being part of both an intellectual and popular discourse. And the popular discourse part really comes from the fact that folks are really questioning, are judges political and how so? And I think media and popular culture in the past, say 2 decades, has really made people think differently and think more about the courts. And so we just see this as really relevant background for the project that we are engaged in. I will say that something that stands out is this book by Judge Cordell, which is not out yet, but it's called Her Honor. And she's talking about her life on the bench. And there are, of course, other books, other biographies and autobiographies where judges are giving voice to how they think about justice and judging. There's another book by Lynn Washington, for example, Black Judges on Justice, that stands out in my mind as really relevant to this topic. But oftentimes, it's mainly scholars that are talking about this topic, right? That are doing empirical work around this topic, and even the theoretical work around this topic in terms of what influences decision making. And what we were really interested in is, what do judges think, right? What do judges think about these topics regarding what influences decision making, and also in terms of how political are the courts. So the data for this project is coming from a data collection project that I've started in 2019, and it's still ongoing. So this is funded by the National Science Foundation's Law and Social Sciences program, which I think was recently renamed, or is going to be renamed. But I received a grant to speak to judges and to survey and interview judges specifically. So what I said that I would do is interview and survey Black and white state court judges. And what I'm really interested in is political representation in the state judiciary or state judiciaries. And so really trying to understand the pathways by which judges, state court judges, get to the bench, but also the significance of having diversity in those spaces. And so the questions that I ask judges in the surveys and in the interviews, they often ask, I often ask questions about, their childhood, their upbringing, their pre-bench careers and lives and adulthood, and also their experiences once on the bench. I also ask judges a number of questions just about their perceptions about topics that we, take up in judicial politics and law and courts. And so the data from this project is what we analyze here. So we fielded a hard copy of the survey, and what we found was that it was really cumbersome for judges to fill it out. And that's what some of the comments were. Like, it took a long time to write everything out. If there was an online version, we would greatly appreciate it. And so after we received the first batch of surveys back in the hard copy, we ended up working with Qualtrics, and we put our survey online. And so judges ended up filling out the survey online, those who didn't fill it out in hard copy form. And so I am presenting the data from the online surveys, just because that data is already input into Qualtrics. And then I have research students who are combing through all of those hard copy surveys to input that data, but it's taking quite a while just because of the global pandemic that we find ourselves in. So the questions that I take up here are from this particular data. These are the judges that responded to the online survey. There are 112 white state court judges and 183 Black state court judges. And so we just last week, actually, we fielded 2,000 additional surveys to white state court judges to increase that number. We fielded it to the same judges, just asking them once again to participate if they haven't had a chance to. And so we're hoping that that boosts the number so that it's much more equitable. So in terms of our questions, and again, this is really preliminary, and that's one of the reasons why I am here today, is feeling a bit disconnected from a scholarly community because I haven't gone to any conferences in the last year or so. And so I'm really hoping to get some feedback in terms of where I might take this, and yeah, just questions about other aspects. I will also say here just that we are thinking about race and whether or not Black and white judges might differ on these different questions regarding the politics of the courts and of judicial decision making. And one thing is, and I think this gets to the broader point of like, why should we care about judges' opinions about these topics? Well, you know, one is that they are insiders, right? They're legal insiders. And they have been told certain things about the courts and about judging. And the question I have is whether or not like that is what will show up in terms of the data, right? So how are they thinking about these topics? The other thing I'm thinking about is in terms of race, which is that Black judges from the surveys, like it's clear that they have racialized experiences. Many of them have been discriminated against. Many of them see the courts in really complicated, complex ways. And so how might they differ from white judges who may not have the same lived, embodied experiences in this country? And how does that map onto the work, right? Because a lot of Black judges go into the court system and into the legal system, really, you know, thinking about justice and thinking about the courts as a site or vehicle to bring about change and make for a more equitable society. And the question is, do other judges, white judges in particular, think in the same vein? So that is sort of our thinking about sort of Black and white judges. So the first question is that we are taking up here is, generally speaking, to what extent are courts political? And the plurality of white judges, so 43 or 44%, said slightly political. Whereas for Black judges, the plurality said 37% said moderately political. And what I noticed as I was sort of coming into this is that Qualtrics gave some percentages and some actual numerical count. So I would say not focusing at all on these images, but perhaps just listening to the statistic that I'm going to give now, or the percentages that I give verbally. So again, white judges 44% said slightly political, whereas for Black judges, 37% said moderately political. So that's sort of the plurality. And then we asked, you know, do judges believe their colleagues' decisions are political? And again, thinking about it in terms of how are they influenced by politicians, reelectability, interest groups, public opinion, their race, gender, ideology, these questions. And so generally speaking, how often do you think judges are influenced by interest groups? And so 46% of white judges said rarely, and 46% of white judges said some of the time. For Black judges, 59% said some of the time, and 31% said rarely. So the majority of Black and white judges are in this sort of rarely, some of the time sort of categories, but you have a lot more sort of Black judges saying some of the time versus rarely. When it comes to being to judges thinking that their colleagues are influenced by politicians, in terms of white judges, 53% of white judges said rarely, 34% said some of the time, whereas 61% of Black judges said some of the time, and 27% said rarely. So 53% of white judges said rarely, whereas the majority of Black judges, 61%, said some of the time. When asked how they think judges are influenced by public opinion, 62% of white judges said some of the time, and 73% of Black judges said some of the time. So perhaps, a significant difference, which I'll get to at the very end. When it comes to judges having to respond to how they think their colleagues are influenced by their desire to be reelected or reappointed or basically hold their seat or their position, 65% of white judges said some of the time, and 21% said rarely, whereas amongst Black judges, 58% said some of the time, and 25% said most of the time. So that's a difference we're interested in sort of further exploring. When asked how often they think their colleagues are influenced by their ideology, 62% said some of the time, of white judges, 62% of white judges said some of the time, whereas for Black judges, roughly an equal percentage said some of the time and most of the time. So 44% of Black judges said some of the time in terms of their colleagues being influenced by their ideology, and 42% of them said most of the time. So again, some and most sort of being the categories that these judges mentioned. When it came to judges thinking about their colleagues being influenced by race, 56% of white judges said some of the time. So the majority of them said some of the time. And for Black judges, 53% said some of the time as well, or also. But the one difference is 22% of white judges said rarely influenced by race, whereas 25% of Black judges said most of the time judges are influenced by race. So I think this is also an important finding. In terms of how often do you think judges are influenced by their own gender, 56% of white judges said that their colleagues are influenced some of the time by gender, so again 56%, and then 60% of Black judges said some of the time. So that is interesting. And then we ask, how do they think about their own decisions? Like, what do they think about their own identities influencing the decisions they make as judges? And really asking this question, about, how political, right, are their decisions then? So we asked, to what extent do you think your race informs your decision making? And so 32% of white judges said not at all, 46% said slightly. So that was the plurality there. The most of the white judges in this who answered this question, right, said slightly. In terms of Black judges, it was more evenly spread across, where you had 28% saying slightly, I think 28% saying moderately, 23% saying not at all, 18% saying very, and 3% saying extremely. Again, this is their race informing their decision making. So here, it's clear that Black judges are thinking that, or there's more Black judges who are thinking that their race informs their decision making than white judges, both in terms of the very category, but also in terms of extremely. And then finally, to what extent do you think your gender informs your decision making? So again, this is their own decision making, the self-evaluation. 51% of white judges said slightly, whereas for Black judges, it was more spread across, where 36% said slightly, 31% said not at all, and then 23% said moderately. So there is, I think a little bit more of Black judges saying that either, not at all or moderately, whereas most of the white judges found themselves in this sort of slightly category. So in terms of next steps, as I mentioned when I started, this project is ongoing. We just fielded the survey again and encouraged additional white judges to participate in this project. And so I think we'll see in the next month or so what happens, but we would love to increase the number of white judges, because right now we have 112. who've submitted online, and we have about 183 Black judges who've submitted. So it'd be great to have more equal numbers there. So in terms of boosting the samples, I think the other big thing is sort of fleshing out the theoretical framework and trying to get a handle on why we think that race might matter. And what we are really turning to now is thinking a lot about the canary in the coal mine analogy, and thinking a lot about Lonnie Guinier's work and Gerald Torres's work, sort of thinking about Black people and minoritized folks from minoritized communities, really being able to shed some light on certain spaces because of their lived experiences. And so we're thinking in the same vein about Black judges who might be highlighting certain aspects of the courts that we should pay attention to because of their personal identities as well as their professional ones. So I think that's just one of the next steps, is like the theoretical framework and thinking about race and just judges in general in these questions. The other thing is statistical analysis. And so I presented here just the percentages, but really asking, are there significant differences, or are the differences significant rather? So we see these differences, some are more stark than others, but are they truly statistically different, is sort of the next steps. And so I look forward to questions and also engaging with you all and getting feedback on things that we might consider as we try to, revise this paper and this project. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Interesting paper. I always love stuff on judging, so we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But Adam, we'll let you take it away from here. And Sam popped in for a second. We'll see if we can get him back. So.
Okay. Are we good? Can you see my screen?
We can.
All right. All right, so good afternoon again, everyone. So this is a project similar to, as Tanisha just talked about, that I'm doing with an undergraduate student. The university had made some money available to do undergraduate research and to allow students to learn that process. So through one of my political behavior courses, I was having conversations with students and obviously talking quite a bit about, what millennials think, what Generation Z thinks. And most of that conversation, though, kept going back to particular policy issues. And those conversations evolved into, well, what do they think about institutions? What do they think about government? What do they think about, specifically for this paper, it turned into, what young people think about elections. And obviously, while these, conversations are taking place, President Trump leading it up to the 2020 election, even going back to the results from 2016, he's publicly criticizing, how our elections are operated, arguing that even with his victory in 2016, there were still widespread examples of voter fraud. The pandemic obviously hits, in early 2020. States, in response, start adopting more mail-in voting, and these criticisms begin to intensify. So when my student and I were able to secure the grant funding, this kind of led us to, this is something we need to take a look at. And from there, we went searching for data, and I'll talk about that data a little bit more in a minute. But the interesting thing, though, is we kind of juxtapose this with overall confidence in elections is relatively high. The MIT Election Lab has been looking at this for the last 20 or so years, and they found that overall, confidence in elections and that, your vote counted as it intended is at least 2/3 of the population. Obviously, that's impacted somewhat by, did your person win? Democratic confidence went down a little bit in 2000, of course, and, Republican confidence went down a little in 2008, and, obviously it makes, some sense there. So we realized, we may not find anything because most people think elections are, properly conducted and their vote actually counts. But again, we do know that there are, unique demographic attributes of that millennial and Generation Z cohort, largely based on, obviously, this is a more diverse group than the baby boomers or Generation X. policy views are quite different, but we just kept hearing over and over again, oh, they're more progressive on same-sex marriage, they're more progressive on marijuana legalization, and again, really wanted to get at, well, where else does this take us? Where else does this matter? Especially as this group starts, running for election or running for office themselves and entering into elections. So our research question for our intents here is whether views of U.S. elections could vary by age, as we've observed with matters of public policy. And if that's the case, then we hope that we can turn this work into something that informs policymakers about the necessity of changes that may need to take place in the operation of our elections. So there are pluses and minuses to doing this now. I think one, it's incredibly timely, of course, because we did, necessity is the mother of invention. We did have to make all these changes to our election system because of the pandemic, finding ways to allow for more early voting, more mail-in voting, of course. But at the same time, that means the data that we use for this project becomes outdated almost immediately because these changes are taking place. So we're kind of balancing that, and I'll talk a little bit about that after I go over the findings and how that might influence the conclusions that we make. So what data did we use for this? Well, Pew Research has an American Trends panel that they're conducting every few months where they do a different wave. Each wave is focused on a different topic. They try to recruit a few thousand new participants for each wave. But in general, they have 13,000 plus individuals that they are sending out these panels to try to get information. And we found for our work, at least in terms of what people view about elections, this Wave 38, which was conducted in fall of 2018, leading into the midterm elections that year, they were questioning about what people thought of the American election system. Obviously, they want first dibs on their data, so they do kind of, no pun intended, quarantine that data for a year or so, which is why we really didn't have access to it to do anything earlier until earlier last year. And again, this is an ongoing project. We didn't dive into all that's available in this data set, so we said, what can we take that for parsimony can give us some information and maybe lead us down a path of what we need to study in greater detail going forward. And we focused in on 3 questions, which had 2 responses, which we thought, again, made it easier to analyze. Whether or not individuals viewed voting as convenient or not convenient, whether or not individuals viewed voting as exciting or boring, and whether or not individuals viewed voting as straightforward or confusing. We started our analysis by looking at just simply doing crosstabs between age and those 3 questions. One of the shortcomings of this data is that in the version made available to us, they recoded the age variable into categories. So with that, it might have been a lot easier for us if we actually had each respondent's age. We didn't have access to that. It also complicates it a little bit. As I'll show you, we can't isolate Gen Z from millennials. So what you wind up having is the traditional model where the youngest age group is half Gen Z, half millennial. The next age group is half millennial, half Gen X, but we still do see changes according to age. From what we found across all 3 crosstabs is that age was a significant factor. We saw that younger individuals were more likely to think that voting was inconvenient. They were more likely to think voting was boring. They were more likely to think it was confusing. So with that, obviously, this is just, univariate relationship. We needed to go further and look to see, what happens when we create multivariate models. So we ran 3 logistic regression models, really not looking at any alternative hypotheses per se. Just really saying, what are these main factors that we know influence what people think, and let's control for those and see if that impact of age is still there. So we bring in partisanship, we bring in gender, education, race, ethnicity, religion, ideology. But the bottom line is, even with all of those introduced into our models, we still find that, our finding from the crosstabs holds that young people think voting is inconvenient, boring, and confusing as well. So this is these 2 tables. First is the results of the 3 logistic regression models. You'll see that age is highly significant across all three models. Gender is also significant across all three models, and I'll talk in a few minutes about how that probably needs to be looked at in greater detail in future models. Education, we only see is impactful in one model. Party ID is also has a consistent impact across all three. Ideology comes into play in the exciting, boring model. Race and ethnicity comes into play in the exciting, boring, and straightforward, confusing models. Obviously, unlike your traditional, ordinary least squares regression model, these parameter estimates, these coefficients aren't easily interpretable. So we move to looking at predicted probabilities to help explain like what the effect sizes of each of these are. And by far, the effect sizes for age are far more significant and far more, visually stunning, I would even say, than what we see for some of these other significant variables. So I'll start talking about those and jump to some of the other variables on the next slide. So instance, we look at convenience, the probability of someone who's 65 and over saying that voting is inconvenient is only 0.08 versus the probability of someone who's 18 to 29, again, half of those are millennials, kind of half of those are Gen Z. Your probability jumps there to almost 0.44. And again, going up with each age group, or going down, I should say, with each age group as we go up in age. We jump to the exciting and boring. Again, almost half. The probability is almost half that individuals who are in that 18 to 29 cohort would say voting is exciting or boring. Would say it's boring. That drops down to about 0.18 when we get in that 65 and older. So those individuals are 65 and over, think voting is convenient. They think it's exciting. They think it's pretty straightforward. Finding the exact opposite for that 18 to 29 cohort. And again, lastly, you got about a 0.35 probability of those 18 to 29-year-olds saying that voting is confusing versus a probability of only 0.15 for 65 and older saying that voting is confusing. So again, significant jumps in probability once we go down in age. If we look at, and I know this is a little overwhelming, but I don't want to just keep clicking through slides and only kind of talking about them. So we'll start up here looking at gender. This is absolutely, I think, the more interesting out of all these other control variables. These are the most interesting. We find that men are more likely to say that voting is inconvenient and more likely to say it's boring. But on the other hand, women were more likely to say that voting was confusing and had a higher probability of saying that. And this is actually one of the larger effect sizes up here, where you almost have a probability of 0.3 among females saying that voting is confusing versus only 0.17 for men. Outside of that, you can see the effect sizes are relatively small. So they recoded all partisanship into simply Republican leans Republican, Democrat leans Democrat. And on convenience, again, you're looking at 0.19 here versus 0.22. 0.27 versus maybe 0.3 if we round up for exciting, boring model. There's just not that much there. A little more difference in straightforward, confusing among party ID, which we see right here, a 0.2 probability versus a 0.25 probability. And again, same thing, if we look at income categories, again, you're going from 0.2 to 0.4 basically based on someone a family making less than 30,000 compared to a family making greater than 75,000. So this is not explaining, most of what's going on. Again, same thing if we look at the ideological categories. You're going from a probability in the convenience model of 0.174 for someone who's very conservative to only 0.25 for someone who's very liberal, stating that voting is inconvenient. Same thing, again, education in the straightforward, confusing model. And again, we see some differences in race and ethnicity with white voters or white respondents versus Black and Hispanic respondents. But again, still far smaller changes in probability as we jump those racial and ethnic categories. All right. So conclusions, future research, where does this lead us? again, age is absolutely the primary driver. So I think speaking to my earlier point about, where this leads us for future research and, the value of this data and that it does become somewhat outdated with all the changes that have gone on right now. We know in response to the 2020 elections that there have been numerous states that have now engaged in attempted rollbacks of mail-in voting and early voting and limiting access to the ballot box. So I think one of the things we're going to need to look at going forward is that, what do young Americans say about this? Are they going to punish people in the voting booths in 2022 and or 2024 if they've engaged in these actions to limit access to voting? Additionally, the fact that young people are finding voting boring and confusing kind of tells us that, we need to emphasize, once again, civic education so young people are leaving high school prepared to engage in the process. And, with that, I think we also need to take a look at gender and in the fact that, men believe voting is boring and inconvenient, but women are more likely to find it confusing. And we know turnout is higher among women. We know that women are more likely to go to college at this point than we're seeing men. So what's accounting for that? Is this just an idiosyncrasy to this data set or is something else going on there? So again, I think we need more data that looks at these questions after everything that's happened in 2020 and leading into 2022 and 2024.
Awesome. That's actually really interesting. This is good stuff. So thank you for that. Let's just hop right in, Sam. We'll have you come next. Thanks for coming on in. And then at the end, we will start our discussion, our open discussion of the papers. So again, thank you, Adam. That was really fascinating.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I look forward to sharing my work with you here. It's my first time on Microsoft Teams, so tell me if I'm doing something wrong.
So far, so good. Just so you know, to share your screen, if you have a presentation, there's a little white box with an arrow pointing up. That's the share screen.
Can you see this? Is it working?
We can.
Okay, so this is a very different kind of set of research than I think the other panelists here. As an attorney, this is work that has come out of my work in legal representation. So I'm looking at compensating Indigenous peoples for cultural damages, and I'm looking specifically at maybe a new trend or an emerging trend in the law. So how did all this start? Here we go. So Indigenous people account for most of the world's cultural diversity, according to the United Nations. And we can think about just so many different cultures around the world and how important each of those cultures are in their traditions and their histories. There are 370 million Indigenous people around the world. Three groups that we're going to look at today are the Lakota Sioux here in the United States, the Bikini Island peoples in the Marshall Islands, and I won't try to pronounce this, an Aboriginal group in Australia. And this is also sort of a progression historically as well. So I'll do today an overview, origins of the project, the stolen lands, what's my research question. I'll look specifically at cultural and spiritual connections to land. Then I'll look at the difference between tort and property law and compensation. And then the three case studies are the Sioux case involving the traditional legal rule, a different approach involving the Nuclear Claims Tribunal in the Marshall Islands, and then a watershed decision involving the Griffiths case in Australia in 2019. And then I'll conclude with looking ahead. So this started way back in the early 90s in Micronesia, where I worked as an attorney. There was a case of a ship ran aground on a ceremonial fishing reef. This is the island up here. This is the chief and the village, and it's sort of located out here in the middle of the Western Pacific. And one of the issues that came up in this case is, what is the proper measure of compensation when a ship runs aground on a ceremonial fishing reef? We think of property law as sort of the main avenue by which one would seek compensation. And this case didn't go to trial, so we never reached that question of what's the fair amount of compensation. It was resolved through negotiation. But it got me thinking about this. How do we consider cultural values when we're looking at property cases? So starting off with this idea of stolen lands, there's a principle in international law, terra nullius, is the idea that when a group comes to uninhabited or unclaimed lands, they can claim it for the crown. And that's what happened with many colonial powers around the world. This is an example here in Australia, coming in saying, hey, no one owns these lands, we're going to claim it for the crown. And it now becomes part of the crown, ignoring the fact that there were people already living there. And this is a problem around the world, this idea of claiming lands that really existed, belong to existing groups. And a lot of this is through force, fraud, or unfair negotiation. So this is a quote from a suit case in 1980. A more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealings will never in all probability be found in our history, which is not taken as a whole the disgrace it now pleases some persons to believe. So this was the court saying how bad the negotiations were with the Sioux at the time that the US was sort of expanding into their territory. So this has led to, around the world, sort of a reckoning that's coming up. What is to be done with the lands that were taken from the original inhabitants? How should compensation work in those cases? In the United States alone, 1.5 billion acres is what's estimated that was taken from the original inhabitants. And for me, I don't really know what 1.5 billion acres is. It's hard to envision that. So we might think of, I don't know, the UK, but then you have to multiply it by 25 times. That's the amount of land in the United States that we're talking about here. So this is a substantial amount of land that has been taken. To what extent should compensation be given, and how should it be given? So the specific research question is, what is the proper measure of damages when indigenous lands are unlawfully taken? And it turns out this is kind of a complicated question. The law on this has traditionally been, as we see in the United States, not very favorable. So if we think about the cultural and spiritual connection that people have with their land, indigenous communities, they have this inherent connection to the land. They might have been there for thousands of years, and they're directly connected with their land, as opposed to a group that sort of recently moved in. Examples would be hunting, fishing, gathering activities, spiritual values, historical connection. Here's an example in Wyoming. This is the National Monument in Wyoming. This is an example of an example of the origin story for the Lakota people, and it has this very strong importance to that community of people. So we can think of the idea of bundle of rights in property law, and this is something that we've sort of passed down from English common law to the United States, is that when you own land, you own it as a bundle of rights. And you only inherit as many rights as the person who had it before you in the chain of title. And those rights can be taken, sold, done things with separately, but the bundle of rights includes all sorts of things. So we would think about the traditional ownership rights, but I think we can have an expanded concept of what rights mean when we think about indigenous connections to the land. So for example, an indigenous right to hunt and fish. And this actually has been recognized in US law. So way back in 1905 in the US versus Winans case, the court found that the right to resort to the fishing places in controversy was a part of larger rights possessed by the Indians, and which were not much less necessary to the existence of the Indians than the atmosphere they breathed. So this case established that the Native Americans retained their right to hunt and fish in the usual and customary places unless they affirmatively gave that right away when they entered into negotiations with the United States as they gave over their lands. So absent giving over those rights, they still retain those. So it's this idea of retaining this stick in that bundle of rights. And I think this is important because it gives us the concept in law that the indigenous community enjoys different attachment to land than non-indigenous people. So now looking specifically at tort law versus property law, there's a very different approach in what kind of damages that we would award. So this is from the Restatement of Torts, comment A. The law of torts attempts primarily to put an injured person in a position as nearly as possible equivalent to their position prior to the tort. The law is able to do this only in varying degrees dependent upon the nature of the harm. Thus, when a plaintiff has been harmed in body or mind, money damages are no equivalent, but are given to compensate the plaintiff for the pain and distress or for the deterioration of body structure. So we recognize that when someone is harmed in a tort case, we need to give more than just compensation for economic loss. We recognize there's a harm to the body and the mind, and we would think of this as sort of a pain and suffering type of damages. Contrast this, though, with traditional property law, again taken from the same source, comment A. On the other hand, when land or chattels have been wrongfully taken from a person, they can be placed substantially in the position that they formerly occupied by giving them specific restoration of that which was taken from them, or by giving its value together with in either case, compensation for the deprivation during the period of detention. So the traditional rule in property law is that you're only entitled to economic damages. Non-economic damages have not been traditionally allowed in property law claims. And this is what had me looking for evidence. Is there any evidence or any precedent anywhere in sort of English common law descendant areas that recognizes something other than economic value in property loss cases? And it turns out we had to look very high and low to find any kind of evidence of this. So the traditional measure, for example, in the Sioux Nation of Indians case from 1980, this case came about from the Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868. So the Great Sioux Reservation, including the Black Hills, would be set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Sioux Nation. So this was the agreement they made with the United States. But subsequent to that, the lands were taken without proper approval by the Sioux people. So in 1946, the Indian Claims Commission Act happened, which allowed the Sioux people and other people to make claims for land that were unlawfully taken from them. And they brought this lawsuit using the takings clause, and the Supreme Court upheld a damage award of $17.1 million plus interest in the lost economic damages for the land. But there was no award for non-economic damages because they followed the traditional rule. The Sioux people to this day have refused to accept this, and the current award value because of interest is now over $1.4 billion. So the Sioux people said this is not adequate compensation. It's not just the economic value of the land. We have a close attachment to our land that was taken from us unlawfully during this period. And here's an example of a sign indicating that these were not for sale. These were essentially taken from us. So is this the right measure of damages? My argument is that no, it's not. So trying to find evidence, precedent anywhere in the world, my research students and I found a case from the Republic of the Marshall Islands. This was 2001. This is a terrible part of history. This was nuclear testing grounds for the United States. They conducted 43 tests on one atoll, 24 tests on Bikini Atoll, and these were the largest tests ever conducted by the United States. In order to do this, though, there was forced relocation of the inhabitants of those islands. So they were moved to other parts of this area, and they cannot return to their lands to this date because they're too radioactive. So this is a whole group of people that had been there over 1,000 years that were forced to move because of the necessity of this kind of testing. So in order to provide compensation, they created a nuclear claims tribunal, and the tribunal ended up awarding $563 million to the people that were displaced in this case. And it was the value of present and future loss of land, restoration costs, and for the first time that we've ever found hardships, in this case, $33.8 million, which included specifically loss of culture was included in this. The court, the tribunal ruled that the people of Bikini have also suffered many hardships through their many years in exile from Bikini Atoll. These hardships consisting of severe food shortages and hunger, disease, loss of culture, and other types of pain and discomfort. So this is the first time we see a court in sort of the English common law jurisdictions awarding something in a property case other than economic damages. So this said to me, there's evidence that I think the court can approach these really serious cases in another way. And just recently, 2019, a case in Australia. This is a watershed decision that I think is the emerging trend in law in this area. This was the Griffith versus Northern Territory of Australia case, also known as the Timber Creek case. So they're original inhabitants of this area. They inhabited Australia. And then through terra nullius, the Crown came in and claimed all of the lands. In response to that, the Native Title Act was passed in 1993, and this said that we don't recognize those original claims. Terra nullius was not true in this case because there were inhabitants there, and that Native people have the right to seek compensation. So this is the first case that has gone through the process that's actually ended up with an award. So it's a very long, complicated case, but in the end, the judge awarded economic loss, interest, and non-economic loss. And this non-economic loss was, I think, the first time in Australia that we've seen this kind of compensation And it's the first time, in this case, the High Court in Australia, upheld this decision of the lower court. And they specifically awarded $2.5 million in damages, 390,000. This is all US dollars I converted it to, was economic, 1.1 in prejudgment interest. And I think the most interesting part is this $990,000 in non-economic losses. And the co-chair of the National Congress of Australian First People said, while no amount of money can adequately compensate for the cultural loss and its consequences, the High Court's recognition of the implications caused by incursions and infringements on the fundamentals of our culture are of some comfort. So I think this is in contrast to the Sioux case in the United States, where this was an insulting amount of money. It doesn't represent the true harm. In this case, you can't really replace that harm, just like you can't replace an arm that's lost in a tort case. On the other hand, the fact that non-economic damages, loss of culture specifically, was awarded in this case, I think made it help the victims in this case recognize that this was an award that was that satisfied their needs in this case. So this is the first case of its kind in Australia. And I think this should represent the emerging trend. I think other jurisdictions should follow this. The court, in ruling for non-economic damages, found that it was not a lot of individual harms that happened by taking of the land. It was more akin to holes in a painting. So if you think about this, you have this painting that represents all of one's interest in land. You take away parts of that by occupying it by someone else, and you lose that cultural attachment. So I think that has very similar parallels to the idea of the bundle of sticks ideas, those native rights that would be part and parcel of ownership of those lands. So looking ahead, I think the law needs to recognize and compensate cultural damages. Property law needs to change and recognize that this is a separate type of damages that warrants compensation. And I think it comes about in a collective harm case. So I couldn't sue for this. This would have to be a collective group of people. And probably it has to be an indigenous group from at least the emerging trend so far, but it's a harm that everyone in that group suffered. So you need a proper claimant who can represent that group. So for example, a chief of a village or something like that, but it couldn't just be any one person. You need a proper claimant in this case. And I think it can only arise in substantial interference with property rights cases. So Bikini Atoll, that's a pretty serious case. This case in Australia is pretty serious. The Sioux case also very serious. But I think it can be expanded to other cases. The same reason that I sort of started this research, these environmental harms cases. When you have substantial environmental harms cases, and this is an example from Micronesia, the court should recognize that not only is the land damaged in an economic sense, but the community that relies upon that land also suffers cultural loss. So this has just happened in Australia. There's this Rio Tinto case. This is a case involving a private mining company that has, against the advice of cultural experts, they conducted a blast which destroyed some many thousand-year-old important cultural artifacts of a community. And the elders described their cultural loss as immeasurable in this case. Based upon the ruling of the previous case, the Timber Creek case, this suggests that they're probably going to be able to get cultural losses as well from this one. And just to contrast this with the United States rule, think about the Exxon Valdez case that caused untold harm to those communities, Inuit communities in Alaska, and they received no compensation for their cultural losses. It was just the economic losses. So I think the next step is to extend this not only to sort of stolen lands cases, but I think can apply to serious environmental cases. So thank you for allowing me to present this initial research. It would not have been possible without my two research assistants, Abby Kovic and Jessica Gibri, who did the bulk of this work. This was amazing work that they did over the last 18 months working with me on this. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That was really interesting, Sam. I appreciate it. All right. So now we're going to move into the kind of the discussion portion of the panel. Now, I know Brian does have to sneak out of here. He said early. I sent him my comments in the chat, but just to kind of paraphrase, and I'll let Adam jump in and Howell. The forecasting models are always kind of fascinating. This is a big line of research in American political science. Big names in the field do it all the time. The Jim Campbells, Alan Abramowitz, Mike Lewis Becks, you name it, the Norpuths, they do it. And they do it well. And so your model has a kind of an interesting wrinkle with the electoral college attempt, but there's that kind of, you seem to have a bigger kind of error. I think if you have a few more, if you read some of those pieces and see their control variables, you can start accounting for why there's such large swings. You just need what they know in your model, and then I think you'll be able to have more of an accurate kind of prediction. Even though you're right, it won't be such a wide variety from the predicted to what the actual happened. So I don't know if Adam or Howell, you want to add to anything to that.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I agree with that. You know, there is a lot of literature in political science and a lot of these models, like PS, if you political science and politics, before every election, all of those big names that were just mentioned will do their own. So I would definitely recommend viewing those. One of the other things to think about, I definitely agree that Electoral College prediction piece definitely makes this unique, and that's great. You may want to look at maybe weighting the quality of the polls based on how they're conducted, one, as well as how far out they are from the election. Because obviously, as we get closer, we get more information. That could also help account for some of the error that you're seeing. So those are my main two comments. Take a look at the literature and start looking at those polls, because some are definitely done better than others and are obviously closer to the election.
So 538 does a great job of rating those polls. So if you go to
Absolutely.
NYSPSA 538 site, that'll do it. That'll tell you the quality of the polling. So, Howell, I don't know if you have anything for that one. I know you're more identity politics, but
I had two sort of small things. The only and more kind of things that your paper made me think about. First, and this is brought up, I think, in the importance of factoring in the quality of the polling, is that it strikes me that we are we've kind of plateaued in perfecting the accuracy of our polling, and that's much bigger challenge than your paper, but it is something that if you're relying on other people's polls to sort of factor in. The second thing, and this is more kind of interesting, I hadn't read the Economist article. It strikes me that a voting bloc that refuses to participate in public polling is a real problem for the enterprise in general. And so, again, beyond the scope of your paper, but something that your paper has me thinking about nonetheless, is how do we as scholars of American politics account for this kind of emerging refusal among Republican voters? That strikes me as a real challenge.
Yeah, why does Trump outperform his polls? Because that group just will not say it. So really interesting, great comment. So Brian, like I said, I know you have to get out of here. If you need to pop out, feel free. But let's move to Tanicia's paper, and how I'll let you take the lead there, and then Adam and I can pop in if we have some comments.
Okay, great. Tanisha, I have so much to say about your paper that I will probably be sending you an email separately. I'm really interested in the project. I think, to start off, I love the way you framed your interest in the project. I love that kind of, I think we all, I like sort of stories that connect the researcher to the research project. And so as I'm thinking about your project, I'm also thinking about something that I am working on myself, which I hate when people do in conferences, but I think that there is a parallel here. I'm working on a project on Amy Coney Barrett and the politics of motherhood in her her nomination and confirmation. And one of the things that really strikes me about Barrett and about motherhood is how candid she was able to be on the national stage about her private experiences in family life. And I think we can compare that to the confirmation hearings of Sonia Sotomayor, who the sort of the only thing that people really latched onto, that her critics latched onto anyway, was this speech that she had given at Berkeley, where she said that a wise Latina woman might make a better judicial decision than a white male judge. And of course, people like Jeff Sessions and Lindsey Graham really latched onto this as an example of how Sotomayor was leveraging her identity in a way that was antithetical to the purpose of the courts. And so I think, like, when you talk about why we should care about a project like yours, I think one of the most important things that what you're doing reminds us is that the politics of who gets to be honest and open and candid about their personal life is itself conditioned by identity. And so I just thought that was that provided a really interesting kind of that's kind of how I was thinking about the project that you put forward. A couple of things that you might think about as you sort of further develop the project is disaggregating your respondents based on where they are judges. It wasn't clear from the presentation how these judges, where these judges were located, but of course, state court judges get their jobs in different ways across the country. And so it's interesting, it would be interesting to see if these results are, how they interact with whether judges are elected or appointed by governors, for example. It seems to me, if I were sort of if I was thinking about this, that might play a role in how a judge is willing to at least be open with you as a researcher about how important their identity is. If they're up for re-election every 4 years or 6 years, it might change the way that they are at least open about those types of things. Something else I thought about was that I love this survey that you've produced, because in some ways it tells us about judges' views of their work, but it also tells us something about the court system. I love that there's this opportunity for judges to reflect on how they feel about their colleagues. And so that seems to me like I think there could be in your data a larger argument about the court system. Like, what does it tell us about the court system as a whole, that a discrepancy exists between how people think others behave, or how judges conceptualize the judicial behavior of their colleagues. And that seems to me to be I think you've got the data for that. That might be a separate paper, but I think that it's something that you could generate from the data that you've already produced. Sorry, again, I said I have a lot of things to say. Another point was that you said 46% of judges said that their race slightly informed their decision making. That strikes me as quite high. I thought that was I thought that was a really remarkable statistic, and so I'm just curious, kind of what we make of that. Like white judges being at least somewhat candid that their identity does shape their judicial decision making. And then the final thing I would say is, how else might we study the effect of identity on judicial decision making? Again, this is probably beyond the survey project, but it seems like maybe looking at doing a more kind of granular analysis of specific race-based cases, gender-based cases. Obviously, the ethnicity doesn't factor into the analysis as much as it might in other iterations, but I was just kind of thinking other ways that if you were to convert this, say, from this survey to a book project, it might be worthwhile to kind of attend to the specific court cases that these judges have decided. But as I say, I love the project. I'm really looking forward to seeing where it goes.
So, Adam, if you want, you can jump in, and then I'll go after you.
Okay. Yeah, I concur. I love the project. Looking at some of those book covers you showed, I think we've been too much focused on, and I think the attitudinal model is great. I went to Stony Brook, studied under Jeff Siegel. So, I mean, there's, we learned a ton from that, but we have to move beyond just simply who appointed me and the interest groups and all that and what happens in confirmation proceedings. So it's great to see this focus on identity. For me, I really honed in on one thing, and this was, so you talk about the lived experiences, and usually whenever we talk about someone going into law enforcement or a legal career, they have some experience prior to that in their childhood, whatever it is. But I'm more focused on just the pipeline and your experience when you make this decision to get in. Just, for the fact that these Black judges, what did they have to do to just get there, which is probably so different than what a white judge did in terms of, where you went to undergrad, what law school you got into, did you get a clerkship? And so for some of these white judges, it's just, I just have to check these boxes. If I do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to be good and become a judge. And for, a Black judge, that probably wasn't the case. So understanding what those barriers might have been, and I don't know how much of that maybe you were able to get in your survey versus not. But then I think connecting that to the question of, their concern about reappointment, because I think, they'll think it's more political because this whole process from day one for them has probably been political versus for many white judges, that they don't necessarily think that's the case. Again, I go to college, I get good grades, I take the LSATs, and I just take each step and go along the way. So I think, again, this is very easily a book project, as was mentioned. There's so many different places to go, but that's really what I honed in on, not just the experience before you make the decision to go into law, but also what you experience once you're there and trying to become a lawyer and then later on a judge. And then the other thing I really wanted to see is you present that gender question at the end. And then I obviously wanted to see it disaggregated there by gender. What do white female judges say? What do, white male judges say? And same thing for black female and black male. So I expect that to be really interesting just as well. So, obviously, I'm sure you can do that, but yeah, I was fascinated. I was hoping that was the next slide and was disappointed it wasn't. So, again, a lot of great stuff here. I think this is a great project. I'm not a judicial person, but again, I wish you well with it, and I think it's going to be awesome as you progress.
Tanisha, you're really lucky here. So you've got people who just love this paper. I think it's a great book project as well. And lucky for you, my dissertation was on the attitudinal model. So as I didn't learn from Siegel, I learned from his books and Spaeth. But one thing, the biggest thing that I see here, the identity stuff is fabulous and fantastic. I'm going to leave that to the other comments. I'm going to focus right on that front end. And the one problem you're going to run into right away is you pull up those pictures and you're right. Those are the biggies. We're talking attitudinal model. You saw the strategic model and the legal model wasn't. They're all in there. You have a blend in there, but that's the big problem, right? You're talking about justices and not state judges. So the person you're missing, and have fun here, is Melinda Gann Hall. Melinda Gann Hall from Michigan State. She has the state Supreme Court database, which is going to have some of the stuff that you need. And it's all about how just state Supreme Court judges make their opinions. And so she has a whole bunch of that stuff that you can blend with the strategic model, because Epstein is really the one, and then of course Martin and Quinn are the ones who really are starting to model that justice-centered viewpoint, which is what your whole front end's all about, is all that justice-centered view that you can then apply to judges, and then how everything's clustered. Because when you have that front end, that back end's going to make so much more. It's interesting to begin with. It's going to really hammer home, because that disaggregation is just so, it's there. You're on to something, right? It's so cool. Just here's the front end to your book. There you go, because this is a book. It's just too big. There's your front end. And then all the stuff on the identity politics in the back it's where American politics and judicial politics is going. So judicial politics was the legal model and the judicial decision making, and then they kind of followed each other, and the strategic model came along, said it was a little bit of this, and then you have your quant people and your qualitative people, and that's it. But there really is, the next move is, how do we, here's the quant, but here's the discussion that needs to come from it, and it's there. And I think it's fascinating. It's timely. I just loved it. I was just so fascinated by it. So great job.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Do we engage, or is it comments and then, because I know we're short on time, right?
Let's get through the last two, and then I'm trying to get through so everybody can just talk back and forth, because I'm afraid your paper is going to get myself, Howell, and Adam going. All right, Adam, you do a lot of stuff that I do. So I'm really was fascinated by this. You took the wind right out of my sails by here's the limitations. I'm like, well, here we go. Because those were some of my comments. But the number one thing I'm guessing you've already thought about this, is the limitations of the wave studies. So I'm guessing when the American National Election Survey comes out results, you're going to try to use that, because you're right. There's that cross between millennials and Gen X, and then millennials and Gen Z, where I think there's a lot of that information, that kind of nuance is right there, but the waves can't account for it, because they don't give you the time to account for it, and it's just so broad. But I think it's interesting, right? And I think, of course, I love that predicted probability on confusion. I was thinking a lot about that. Why do young females, maybe even specifically, find the voting process more confusing than younger men? And I wonder how much that relates to just some of those old stereotypes of politics is a man's game. And because we kind of went away from that, right, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, But there's been this weird kind of flip back to like, I don't know if it was the rise of the religious right in the late 80s and like the Bush era movement of young people, like, of like, no, this is a man's world. Like, these are men's questions. And it's like, and that's starting to permeate with younger generations again. I'm just trying to figure it out. But it's something I see anecdotally in the classroom. But now you have some numbers. So I think that's, and I think you get it too. I think that's the hook, right? I think that's I can't wait to see more. I just can't wait to see what you find. I mean, I wish I could give more, but that's all I'm thinking of. So,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I always tell my students that young people don't participate in politics because politics weren't designed for them, and I think your project underscores that. So I would say some of this. It feels intentional from students' perspectives that they're sort of shut out of the political process. So in some ways, what your project demonstrates is a pervasive truism of American politics, which is that young people are less politically engaged, at least in the sort of traditional sense of what political engagement looks like. My only thing, I thought it was interesting that you said in Tanisha's project that she should, that you were hoping for her to disambiguate the gender category, because I kind of feel the same way about this figure that women were more likely to say that they found politics confusing. I'd really like to see kind of how that maps out according to other demographic characteristics. But yeah, as I say, I think that what you're working on here provides, I think, a good contemporary demonstration of this sort of perpetual leaving out of young people out of the political process.
Thank you.
All right, and last but certainly not least, Sam, your paper a lot different than the others, of course. But I will say I thought it was really interesting. I just kind of, from a law perspective and a background, talking about marginalized groups and kind of compensation is always kind of fascinating. So my kind of overarching comment would be, I guess this would be more timely. This is timely because we're talking about like, this would have to go in the United States to the Supreme Court, and Justice Gorsuch is the native rights justice, right? It has a background with these kind of decisions and has a history of writing opinions that talks about culture in relation to native lands. So that might be a line of kind of thinking and research with amici briefs on, because we know they have influenced the justice decision making on the Tahira case, maybe timed and thought about cases that would go to the Supreme Court to Gorsuch. I would wonder if that would maybe like be the where this line goes, is how you target a Supreme Court justice specifically to get them to vote to hear a case. I think that's a natural kind of progression, especially because we actually have a justice on the court who has openly written and discussed native rights in the states. So that was my major comment, got me thinking of it, but very fascinating as well.
I'll jump in. Yeah, again, definitely not my field. I found the paper really, really interesting. So I guess when I'm hearing and I'm thinking, what else can this be applied to? What else can, make it timely? Not being a judicial scholar and definitely being able to say, how is this going to be granted cert versus not or anything like that. But the thing that popped into my head for whatever reason, Pete Buttigieg had a quote very recently, said, racism is built into our highways. And you're thinking about the damage. I started thinking about, all the communities that were destroyed by the interstate highway system and all of that. I don't know if that could ever be applied to that, but, then that brings in racial and ethnic politics, and that, I mean, that would be huge and incredibly costly for many states and cities who just decimated whole communities. I think of, the Cross Bronx Expressway and everything Robert Moses did in New York City in the 50s and 60s. So I don't know, knowing that you were providing a lot of international examples, I don't know if outside of indigenous peoples, that could be a domestic example that you could possibly, start looking into whether there's any applicability there. So I know that's kind of a pie in the sky and not really centered on what you're trying to do. But that's what popped into my head. And I think that would have a lot of repercussions, even for ongoing gentrification and everything else that's going on in urban areas in the United States.
echoing what's been said about not being my area, I did also find the paper really interesting. And I think it's a noble project, which is to find ways to address the claims of Indigenous peoples within the court system. But it strikes me that through kind of a property law rationale. But as I'm thinking about property law, I'm thinking about, and sort of the English legal tradition, I think about, Locke and Locke's sort of theory of property, and so much of those sort of foundational ideas are grounded in a belief in a perpetual expansion. In other words, so there's a kind of colonial logic baked into America's legal institutions. And so while, again, I think it's an extremely noble project, and I think that something has to be done in the form of restitution, I agree with that. But I think generally, as I was kind of listening and thinking through what you're presenting, I think the project kind of underscores for me the inadequacy of our judicial institutions to engage in, or to say liberal judicial institutions generally, to engage in the kind of restitution and reparation that is really necessary in the examples that you provide. That's not a way to say that it's not a worthwhile endeavor, but I think that, are our institutions even equipped to process the claims that you're describing, is an open question for me.
Yeah, very good comments. I appreciate all three of your comments.
All right. Well, you're welcome. Hey, we got a few minutes left, so if there's anybody who wants to say anything else, talk to each other, make some comments back. I think it's been a really fascinating kind of panel, and I don't know about you, Hal. I think it's been a great blending. I really do. Yeah.
I had a question for Sam. And I guess what I kept coming to was the work of Angela Riley and her thinking about owning red, and her work with, or sort of being in meditation and thinking a lot about Cheryl Harris's Whiteness is Property. And so I wondered how much of that you engaged with, and if that was sort of an important analytical piece for you in your work, because I definitely see how the colonial logic is built in, but I'm also wondering about the pushback against this sort of reckoning that's happening, and the court's role in it, and sort of thinking about whiteness as property, and sort of Riley's work on Indigenous property in particular.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I just made a note here. It's on my research agenda. Trying to find precedent to change the law is so difficult. So that's why we've had to look very far afield to try to find any kind of case law that helps us here. But yeah, these are some really good ideas of places to go to look for more potential arguments.
All right. Anybody else? Well, if that's everything, really has been just a fascinating panel. One, I think it worked out incredibly well. So, and I appreciate all you and all your time and the ideas. And it's nice to have some kind of intellectual discussion again. Like, even though it's behind a computer, at least it's nice to see somebody else besides the wall around me.
Well, thank you for organizing, both of you.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone.
All right.
Yeah, I really appreciate the organization and the time it takes to do this, and then just be able to share the work that we do. It's we're all in very narrow fields, and there's not many people like us usually where we are. So it's neat to be able to share it with other people. I just regret that I couldn't hear all of the other talks, but I'm going to watch it when it's on, on recorded version.
Absolutely. All right. Well, take it easy, everyone. It's a pleasure, and we'll hope to see you at the live panels during the conference.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.